Good morning. I am John Levy, and it is my distinct honor to serve as the 10th chair of the board of the Legal Services Corporation. I hope you all had a great Father's Day weekend, and on behalf of our LSC board, I want to welcome you now to this very important virtual briefing on the significance of civil legal aid to those facing evictions due to COVID-19 and its economic fallout. We're especially privileged this morning to hear from one of the country's foremost experts on eviction, Matthew Desmond, the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. And he is the founder and principal investigator of the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. We will also be honored to hear remarks from Minnesota Congressman Tom Emmer, who has previously spoken so passionately at forums on access to justice, both in Washington and in Minneapolis. We will also have a report from the field with a panel discussion among certain of LSC's hardworking, dedicated grantees and a judge integrally involved in the eviction process. Concluding remarks today will be provided by LSC's terrific Vice Chair, Father Pius. Eviction is a major concern for LSC and its 132 civil legal aid organizations that it funds across the country. Last year, those grantees handled more than 170,000 eviction-related cases, nearly a quarter of all of the cases they brought to closure. Continuing its tradition of promoting innovative solutions to problems such as eviction, last year LSC awarded 5 technology initiative grants, 4 Pro Bono Innovation Fund grants to tackle housing and eviction-related issues. The year before, to help focus attention on the national eviction crisis, LSC convened a wide-ranging congressional briefing on eviction. And now LSC is launching this year a significant study of evictions, and later will impanel a special task force devoted to the crisis in eviction and other related housing issues across our country for low-income individuals. Clearly, we need to revamp the system. And in the fiscal year 2020 appropriations bill, Congress actually provided $500,000 to LSC for the very purpose of having LSC conduct and publish a study of communities and states and territories with high rates of unmet legal needs involving eviction. It called on called on LSC to use data regarding eviction rates, availability of legal aid or other free legal advocates, and differences among laws and procedures affecting evictions in different areas. In addition, LSC is urged to explore opportunities to increase access to eviction-related legal aid in such states and territories, including through LSC's Pro Bono Innovation Fund. This study is already underway. It will continue through next year. But unfortunately, LSC and its grantees are about to become even more deeply engaged in the legal issues surrounding eviction as a result of a pandemic and the economic upheaval it is causing. As I'm sure you all know, the Department of Labor reported an increase of 14 million people unemployed between February and May in our country. Unemployment has hit renters particularly hard, given that they work a disproportionate share of service sector jobs that disappeared under stay-at-home orders put in place to fight the pandemic. In one survey, more than half of the renters reported losing their jobs because of COVID-19. The full impact of the pandemic and the attendant economic upheaval has been delayed by various eviction moratoria. The freeze on federally backed mortgages, which covers more than 12 million of the nearly 44 million rental units in the country, will expire in just 2 months, on August 31st. Many states and local governments also had moratoria in place, but courts in 25 states are now resuming eviction hearings, and others are about to lift eviction freezes as well. Another government initiative about to expire will also contribute to a spike in evictions. The federal boost to unemployment benefits that many laid off workers have used to pay their rent is set to end on July 31. So it is no wonder then that LSC's grantees and other civil legal aid providers are bracing for a huge surge in evictions, using terms like tsunami to describe what they fear is coming. The worst of it is still weeks away, but already there are indications of what is likely to come. Virginia resumed eviction hearings on May 18th and is seeing a wave of proceedings. More than 700 cases were heard statewide in the first few weeks after the freeze was lifted, and at least 2,200 cases are on the Richmond docket for the next few weeks. Shelby County, Tennessee, the Memphis area, resumed eviction hearings last Monday with 9,000 pending eviction cases, about a third more than this time last year. Well, this coming onslaught of eviction filings threatens to overwhelm the civil justice system in the hardest hit areas and extend an imbalance that already plagues housing courts across the country. Unfortunately, in many of these courts, 90% of the tenants are unrepresented, while 90% of landlords have counsel. This is more than bad optics. Studies in a number of states show that in the system as it is currently designed, having a lawyer significantly increases the odds of being able to stay in one's home, at least temporarily. In New York City, for example, tenants who represent themselves are evicted in nearly 50% of the cases, while those represented by a lawyer prevail and stay in their homes nearly 90% of the time. Now more people, perhaps more people than ever before, will be thrown into this system, having lost their jobs, facing losing their homes in the middle of a pandemic. They may also experience something else. And that's something else which we all regard as fundamental to being an American, is fair access to justice. There are many compelling arguments for increasing funding for civil legal aid, and you've heard many of them from me over the years, but few resonate as deeply and powerfully as the circumstance we now confront. Although pro bono and technology can help, the only real way to ensure that these Americans, many in the worst moments of their lives, have appropriate access to justice is to fully fund civil legal aid across the country. And ultimately, to design a system that provides a greater sense of fairness and balance to those who, for whatever reason, become enmeshed. It is essential, in my view, to the future of our republic. For as Thomas Jefferson so powerfully observed, the most sacred of the duties of government is to do equal and impartial justice to all of its citizens. Folks, this is happening on our watch and in our time. We just have to do better. Thank you very much. I'm excited to hear from our presenters this morning, and to get us started, our distinguished President, Ron Flagg, Ron has been with LSC after being a practitioner for so many years. We're so fortunate to have him at LSC at this critical time. Ron Flagg.
Thanks, John. Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome and thank Matthew Desmond for being with us today. Matt is the Maurice P. During Professor of Sociology at Princeton. As John just mentioned, Matt is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Evicted: Poverty and Profit in the American City. Critical to our discussion today, Matt is also the founder and principal investigator of the Eviction Lab at Princeton. Matt, we're so glad to have you join us, and here's why, and John mentioned each of these. One, about a quarter of the cases closed by the legal aid programs LSC funds involve eviction actions. Second, as John has described, Congress has directed LSC to study evictions, and in particular, how differences in laws across the country affect eviction rates. And third, as I think we're all aware, COVID-19 has created the potential for an unprecedented spike in evictions across the country. So with that as the backdrop, and as LSC and others are trying to learn more about evictions in America, I think most of us are relying on the unique database of evictions that you and your Eviction Lab colleagues have built. So just to sort of ground us in Eviction Lab 101, could you tell us please about the Eviction Lab database? Why did you create it in the first place? And how do you obtain the data? And are there limitations on the data you have?
Thanks, Ron. It's good to be with you all today. So I wrote a book on eviction in 2016, and I started going around the country talking to folks about this problem. And I'd go to Houston or Baton Rouge, or I'd go to St. Louis, and advocates there, city leaders there, citizens there were asking these questions that we had no answers to, like how bad is eviction in my city? Is Milwaukee really high eviction city? Is it a low eviction city? What cities are doing it right? Which laws work? And we had answers to none of those questions. The federal government doesn't collect data on eviction. It doesn't even collect data on eviction from public housing it actually owns. We have no idea, for example, from the federal government, if this PHA in Cleveland has a higher eviction rate than this PHA in Washington, D.C. And so I thought we really need to build a national database. We need to figure out how many Americans get evicted every year. We need to figure out where the problem is located and what interventions are working. And so I assembled a team at Princeton, and we started just hustling for these data. We started going to state courts, county courts, JP courts in the case of Texas. We got kind of chased out of court in Kentucky. We learned that there's a stack of eviction records in trailers in West Texas. We found eviction records in gas stations in some states. I mean, this is the state of our data on eviction. And it's like pretty scandalous to me. Imagine if we didn't know how many Americans graduated from high school or were diagnosed with cancer every year, but that's where we were with this problem. So we hustled for those data. We purchased data from third-party vendors. We basically did everything we could to try to get as much data as we could do. And then we built this database. Then we cleaned these data and we geocoded them so we know exactly where they happen. And then we published it. We published it before we published any studies on it. We wanted to get it out there. And we wanted to get it out there in a form where you don't need two PhDs from MIT to figure out how to navigate the data. You know, we made interactive maps. We worked with a web design team that has interactive graphics. You can click a button and download PowerPoint slides. We wanted people to use it, and they have. So since we launched about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I think, about 500,000 people have been to our site, and and have used these data in over 500 news stories. So I think we're getting the word out there, and it reflects how hungry a lot of people are for this information.
Yeah, I would urge people, not now, but after our presentation today, to go to the Evictions Lab website. You can go and enter your city, your county, compare it to other cities and counties as to the rate of eviction filings, the rate of actual evictions, and you can puzzle over the differences and what's causing the differences, because that's not evident in the data itself, and that's what I'd like to get to now, Matt. So, we're sitting here on this Zoom call during the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's, it seems like we've been doing a lot of this for a long time, but as memory serves, the pandemic did not mark the beginning of our housing crisis. Could you describe evictions in America pre-pandemic? What were the statistics? Who was getting evicted? Where were they taking place? And what were the factors that were driving these different statistics that we see on your Eviction Lab database?
Yeah, so as so many of you know better than I do, renters around the country have been really feeling a pinch in the last 15 years. Incomes for many American families have been flat. They've fallen in real terms in some parts of the country, but rents have soared. They've soared all around the country, in all regions of the country, and so have utility costs. And so we have the shrinking gap between what families are bringing in and what they have to pay for basic shelter. And then we have government inaction at the federal level. We do not have Congress stepping up to address this need. So only about 1 in 4 families who qualify for any kind of housing assistance receive it. The waiting list for public housing in some of our big cities is no longer counted in years, it's counted in decades. And so that's pushed a lot of families really close to eviction. According to the American Housing Survey, about half of all renting families below the poverty line spend at least 50% of their income on rent and utilities, and about 1 in 4 of those families spend over 70% of their income on shelter costs. So, you're paying 60, 70% of your income on housing costs alone. You don't need to make a big mistake to get evicted. You're living under that threat constantly. So what's the problem look like? So by our estimates, in 2016, which is our most recent data year that covers the whole country, because we got tens of millions of eviction records. We have 60 million eviction records going back to 2000. So in 2016, 3.7 million eviction filings were distributed across America. So that's 7 eviction filings a minute in the United States. That number, 3.7 million, is much higher than all the foreclosure starts, even at the height of the foreclosure crisis. So for renters in America, there's foreclosure crisis level displacement every year on a regular basis. Now, where does eviction happen? And when I was studying Milwaukee and looking at the numbers in Milwaukee, I thought Milwaukee was a pretty high evicting city. About 1 in 30 renter homes evicted on average in that city every year. In the inner city of Milwaukee, it's about 1 in 14. But Milwaukee doesn't even make the top 10 list in our list of cities. It doesn't even make the top 30. The cities that have the highest evicting rates in the country are places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Richmond, Virginia, where 1 in 9 renter homes is evicted every year. These are not the cities that we usually talk about when we talk about the housing crisis, but these are the cities that have the highest evicting rates. And when you look at the data, you also realize that this is a problem that just isn't just affecting big cities on the coasts, and it's not just affecting cities in general. It's affecting rural communities, small towns, small cities like Wilmington, Delaware, for example, has a very high eviction rate. And so I think this is important from a policy perspective, because when we talk about the housing crisis in terms of, gee, it's really expensive to live in Seattle or New York City, that is capturing a reality for many renting families. But we also have to talk about the housing crisis and eviction, which tends to be pretty high in low-cost cities. The story about where evictions are happening or where they're concentrated, I'm sorry, is the old American story. It's a story about racial discrimination. It's a story about the legacy of racism and our systematic dispossession of people of color, and especially African American families, from the land, from the soil of America. And so most evictions aren't concentrated in gentrifying neighborhoods. Most evictions are concentrated in segregated low-income African American communities, where even there, people are having a really hard time keeping a roof over their heads.
Let's again sort of continue on the eviction 101 front. Could you talk about what the eviction process actually looks like? You saw it up close in your research in Milwaukee and elsewhere. You were, I think, embedded in Milwaukee in a couple different locations for the better part of a year. So what is eviction? What does it look like to the people who are affected by it?
It varies widely across the country. The laws really do matter. You know, in some states, it's pretty cheap to carry out an eviction. You know, as cheap as $15 in some areas. In other states, it's expensive. It's almost $300. And but the basic kind of terms are the same. You know, if a tenant falls behind or violates a lease, the tenant is served an eviction notice. Now, in some states, like South Carolina, the lease actually is the notice, and it allows landlords to kind of skip this step. In other states, an eviction notice can be just a piece of paper or a napkin. You just kind of hand to the tenant saying, you know, you usually pay up or leave, you know, 5 days or quit. It's important to emphasize, too, that in many states, there are so-called no-cause evictions. A tenant can be playing by the rules, can have not done anything to violate the lease and still be subject to an eviction. If the 5 days pass or the kind of time allotted in the notice passed, then the tenant is served, given a summons, a complaint, usually by a third-party process server or a sheriff, and that gives the tenant a court date. And so eviction court, as all of you know so much more deeply than I do, it is not a court really. It's kind of an eviction processing plant. In Charlotte, North Carolina, the commissioners have about 100 eviction cases an hour because they know that most tenants aren't going to show up. They don't have legal counsel, most of them. They know that their odds of winning the case are very slim. And so, you know, in Milwaukee, there's a 70% default rate. In Baltimore, it's 80%. One study showed that in Detroit, it's 90%. So the sound of eviction court is really a name, a silence, you know, an absence of a person, and a default judgment being allocated. Once that default judgment is allocated, a landlord can take that and summon the sheriff, execute a writ of restitution. And that's when you get the knock on the door and the sheriff coming and the movers taking your stuff and piling it on the sidewalk or putting it in bonded storage. And that's kind of the full frame of legal eviction. You know, a lot of families move before the sheriff comes. A lot of families are not evicted through the court system. They're informal evictions or soft evictions. And so I've met a landlord that would pay a family to move. Say, if you're out by Sunday, I'll give you $200. You can use my van, you know. I met a family or a landlord that will take your door off if you're behind in rent. And so, you know, we did a study in Milwaukee that showed that for every formal eviction that goes to the court, there are 2 informal evictions that are executed. So the numbers we have, they're just legal evictions. Those are court-ordered evictions. And those numbers are really scary, but they're not capturing the full extent of displacement.
Thanks. So you did a heroic job of trying to capture the evictions laws across probably tens of thousands of jurisdictions in a few words. Do you have any sense as to whether the differences in the laws that you're describing, the cost of evictions, the formality of the notices, the nature of the housing court, any sense as to whether differences in those laws make a difference in the eviction rate?
Yeah, I think they do actually. And so one of the things we started noticing when we went through the data was, it'd be like, okay, here's someone and she's being evicted or taken to eviction court in January, then February, then April, then May, then June, then November. They're like, what's going on? And we identified this process of serial eviction where some property owners are taking folks to court over and over and over again. And we thought that, let's look into this a little bit more. And what we found is that, in some places of the country, that happens a lot. Like in South Carolina, for every eviction that is processed in the court, for 50% of those evictions, the person has been there once before already. It's a return. But in like places like Alabama, the rates are much lower. And so we were like, what explains that? If you look at like Charleston, South Carolina, Mobile, Alabama, which we did, these are cities that are demographically similar, have similar poverty rates, but it's different is the law. So, to speak crudely, in South Carolina, evictions are cheap and easy. And in Alabama, they're expensive and slower. And so in South Carolina, you don't have to serve a tenant with an eviction notice. You can go straight to the summons. In Alabama, that's not the case. You have to have that additional step. In South Carolina, if you're an LLC or a company, you don't need to hire an attorney to execute your evictions. You can get your property manager to do it. You can do it yourself as a property owner. In Alabama, you do have that attorney requirement. In South Carolina, I believe it costs around $40 to file an eviction with the court. In Alabama, it's over $200. And so we did a statistical model that kind of collected all of those differences, and it showed two really clear things. For every kind of added kind of constraint on property owners, they tend to use eviction court as the court of last resort, not the court of first resort. The model also showed that of all of those things, what made the biggest difference was the attorney requirement. The attorney requirement was really the thing that kind of slowed the eviction process, or at least the serial eviction process down. Let me just real quick on this thing. This isn't just about like living under a regime that is stressful or inconvenient to renters. This is about real money. So by our estimates, serial evictions increase a renter's housing costs by 20% because they have to pay court fees and late fees to stay in their home. So on top of rent, they have to pay this additional 20%, which means the housing crisis is worse than it even looks on paper. And it looks really scary for a lot of these renters. Now, what's going on? Why are they getting drugged to court over and over and over again? Well, one thing that's happening is like most Americans now are not paid on a monthly basis, right? Most of us do not get our checks at the first of the month for the entire month. Most of us are paid on a bi-weekly or a weekly basis. But rent comes due on the first. And so there's this kind of disconnect between the realities of the modern labor market and how the housing market is responding to that. So we talked to landlords and property owners and property managers about this in both of those states that I mentioned, and we asked them why they don't just work with tenants. Why don't they just kind of be more flexible? Why have eviction court adjudicate this? And one of the things they brought up again and again, and I know this is an unpopular thing to hear in this audience, but they brought up the Fair Housing Act, and they brought it up so much it's not something that we could ignore. And they said, look, if we give Sally a break and not Susanna, maybe there's going to be some bias that I'm confronting. And even though I know that Sally's good for it and she's good for it every month, I leave myself susceptible to FHA violation. We can't do that. So everyone that's behind by the 5th, it's like everyone gets the eviction notice.
You raised you answered the question about the effect of different laws. What about the effect of lawyers? You made reference to the fact that lawyers tend to slow down what is otherwise a wholesale process. Can you provide any further elaboration or insight on how access to a lawyer affects evictions?
So studies are pretty clear on this point. Access to full legal counsel helps your case. It helps you immensely. A study conducted in the South Bronx showed that irrespective of the merits of the case, where lawyers were just randomly assigned cases, success rate to keeping families in their home was about 80%. Studies that have kind of looked at the effect of a lawyer in Massachusetts, in New York, and Philadelphia, and other cities have found that this kind of upstream intervention is much cheaper than the downstream consequences of eviction, especially in terms of shelter costs and homelessness services and additional kind of fallout of eviction. So, if I was getting evicted, I would hire a lawyer. And I think that, what a lot of the advocates around the country are asking for is not necessarily, they're asking for a lawyer. And it's interesting and telling that they're asking for that right in eviction court. It's telling that that's their ask, right? Over all the things that could be asked for and demanded of in the housing crisis. And I think that's very important to recognize. Studies also show that if we try to go cheap on the intervention, it doesn't work. So bundled legal services, kind of a legal aid, a table at court, on a case-by-case basis, I'm sure those things can really matter. But statistical studies show that if you really want to make the difference in lowering the eviction rate, you need to have a full lawyer, full representation.
You talked about serial evictions. Could you talk about the consequences of evictions, the consequence of the first eviction in terms of subsequent evictions, access to loans, access to subsidies, the effect on children?
Yeah, sure. So, eviction causes loss. Families lose their homes, obviously, but that means they often lose their community and neighborhood, and kids lose their school. A lot of families lose their stuff, which is taken by movers or piled on the street to be scavenged by neighbors. It obviously takes a good amount of time and money to build a home, and eviction can just delete that. So eviction comes with this mark, as you mentioned, this mark, and that can have a deep effect on people's lives, because a lot of landlords see that mark of eviction and they say no. They say no thanks, because from a landlord's point of view, it's a measure of risk. And so that's why studies show that after eviction happens, when families finally relocate to subsequent housing, they relocate into worse neighborhoods with higher levels of crime and poverty, and they relocate to worse housing. We also know that public housing authorities, even though they don't have to, count eviction as a mark against people's application, which means we're systematically denying housing help to the families that need it the most. We have studies that show that eviction causes job loss, and if any of y'all on this call have been evicted, you know why that is. It's such a consuming, stressful event. It can cause you to make mistakes at work and lose your footing in the labor market. And then there's the effect of eviction on your mental health. So studies have linked eviction to suicide. We have a study that shows that mothers who get evicted experience higher rates of depression 2 years after the event. Even getting an eviction filed on you and not displacing you can have a negative effect on your life. It can harm your credit. It can prevent your future housing choices. and it can kind of follow you around. And so I think when we add all that up, we conclude that eviction isn't just not just a condition of poverty, it's a cause of poverty. It's making things worse. And it is leaving a deep and jagged scar on the next generation. You know, when I started studying evictions, I thought kids would be a mitigating factor for eviction. They're not, they're an aggravating factor. We did a study of tenants in eviction court because we were trying to figure out, why does this person get evicted and this person doesn't, especially when they owe the landlord the same amount of money. And the thing that made the difference wasn't race, it wasn't gender, it wasn't even how much they owed the landlord, it was kids. You know, the chances of they getting an eviction judgment in court almost tripled, all else equal. And what you're seeing in there is landlord discretion, I think.
So, Matt, everything I think you've talked about so far applied before COVID-19, and obviously COVID-19 has made all of the things you're talking about more imminent, worse, or at least potentially. I think we're generally aware of the circumstances. The pandemic hit. We've had stay-at-home orders across the country. Businesses have closed. Over 40 million people have filed unemployment claims in the last few months. And as a result, renters are finding themselves in a position where they could not pay the rent. I'd like you to talk about two things generally. One is, you know, how did the government, both the federal government and state and local governments, respond to the challenges I just described? And, you know, how did that work? What has been the effect on evictions during the pandemic so far? And then, of course, the even harder question, which is, you know, what's going to happen going forward from here as the moratoria expire?
Right. So states rolled out moratoriums. So the federal government rolls out the CARES Act, you know, and the CARES Act doesn't have a lot for renters in it, but it does have one provision, which is kind of blocking or preventing eviction from federally backed housing. So housing that has Section 8 subsidy, for example, or other kind of federally backed subsidies. I think from a legal point of view, we need to pay attention to if evictions are actually in violation of the CARES Act. So the National Income Housing Coalition has a database of addresses and mortgages that are covered by the CARES Act. We've been linking that database to new evictions that are filed. And we found things like in Houston, for example, 7% of all new eviction filings are in clear violation of the CARES Act. And this is even in a system where landlords have to sign a paper saying, you know, this address is not protected by the CARES Act. So I think that we need to make sure the laws on the books are actually laws that are being enforced on the ground. And I think that's the data effort. So states rolled out moratoria. Every state did, but the moratoria varied like widely in protections. You know, some states, Minnesota, Delaware, Massachusetts, Connecticut, they had pretty toothy renter protections. You know, they stopped evictions at all part of the process, the beginning, middle, and the end. But a lot of states had very weak protections, and that did not break down along the lines that a policy usually does, you know, red or blue states or anything like that. So California had you know, pretty weak statewide moratoria, gave a lot of discretion up to locality. So if you're in San Francisco, that's great. But if you're in other places like Vallejo, you know, you are subjected to a different sort of levels of protection. So in the Eviction Lab, on the Eviction Lab website, we like covered thousands of legal documents and try to boil all this down into a really digestible tool. So we like rated every state's moratoria. 5-star rating. And so you can go on our website and look at what's going on in your state. And we wanted to give renters a sense of what rights and protections they were facing. States have done other things. They've redirected CDBG funds, for example, into rent relief. Wisconsin did this. Montana's done this. Some states have started to think about rent relief not as a 1-month sum, which is how we usually think about it, but as a 3 or 4 month sum. So Philadelphia did this, for example. Some states have just abolished late fees during COVID, which sounds minor and is, but I think is still really important. And so, but no one has figured out like the big question, which is like, what's going to happen to the rent arrears as the moratoria expire? The federal government hasn't acted on this. The HEROES Act does provide, I think, $100 billion in rent relief that passed the House, but McConnell said, I believe he said that was dead on arrival in the Senate. The folks that are in Washington believe that there's not going to be real movement on that unless there are clear and acute signs of pain coming from after the moratoria expire and after the benefits stop. So what's going to happen? So I think anyone that answers that question like that with confidence or any kind of confidence about the housing market, I'm always really skeptical of those answers. You know, the housing market is so confusing sometimes and hard to decipher, but it's hard to think that evictions aren't going to spike after the moratorium are lifted. So the question is where and by how much. And so we've just launched a new tool at the Eviction Lab called the Eviction Tracker. And we have about a dozen cities and we're paying attention to where, and we're tracking their evictions on a weekly basis. Again, like no one else does this. Like the federal government doesn't track evictions like the unemployment rate. And so we're doing it in every city that we can. It's not every city, but it's every city that we think we can. If you think we can do this in your city, please reach out. We'd love to add more cities. So evictions are up in Milwaukee. They're starting to spike in Cleveland. The moratoria clearly did work. It drove evictions down, but they are starting to creep back up. One thing that we just might want to keep in mind, like evictions, they're like a weird economic indicator. They don't respond. They don't respond to other things other economic indicators respond to. For example, evictions have been pretty flat over the last 15 years, which is bizarre because rents have not been flat. Evictions don't really spike that much in recessions. They don't really go down that much in economic boom times. And so there could be a lot of things that happen. One thing that we do know about evictions is that like certain landlords and certain buildings drive eviction rates in a really outsized way. So for example, in Boston, 10 people, not 10 companies, 10 people evict about 15% of the city. And so when we think of like solutions to possible interventions after the moratorium, one possible solution would be for legal aid offices to figure out, and y'all already know who these actors are, I think, just from being in the trenches, figure out where are the evictions most likely to spike, in what buildings and by what property owner, and actually target those buildings for intervention. I think that precise kind of strike could actually have a big effect on the overall displacement rate.
So let's, in closing, go back to, the good old days. Wish they had been good before COVID-19. What's your view as to what laws, what measures federal or state or local governments had taken that affected the eviction rates in a constructive way?
Yeah. I think that, from a list perspective, I'm a proponent of a right to counsel in housing court. I think that's a wise, just use of federal funds, and it does balance the scales in housing court. I think that can be done in a lot of different ways. We could keep it adversarial and just fight it out. But, Cleveland has a community court. Red Hook in New York City has a community court. And this is kind of a combination of legal services and direct services. So you go to a lot of eviction courts and they say, Mr. Desmond, I understand you're behind $500. Is that true? And you say yes. And then it's over. It's kind of over for the tenant. But in community courts, which is kind of funded by the Center for Court Innovation, you answer that question yes, and the judge says, why? What happened? and you say, I relapsed, I lost my job, my kid, whatever happened. And there's social workers that try to plug you into services that day. They try to get the landlord paid a little bit and try to keep the family in the home. That's a win-win-win, but that's demanding that our courts function as institutions of justice instead of the things that they are now. I think that, without serious federal investment in this issue, we're going to continue living under this regime where, families are threatened by eviction, not by the tens or the hundreds of thousands, but by the millions every year. And so the good news about that is that, programs that we have in place, like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, they work. Families consistently do one thing with their freed up money when they receive a housing voucher, which is they buy more food and their kids get stronger. They don't move. They're not subject to eviction as much. They move to better neighborhoods. They work only for the lucky minority of families that benefit from them today. So I think that this is an opportunity to ask for big things. And I think that everyone needs the right to a shelter and a good, stable home. And I think one ground proven way to provide that to renters is take this program that we have and just expand it to everyone below the poverty line.
Matt, I wish we had another 45 minutes or another hour and 45 minutes. Thank you so much for joining us today. More importantly, thanks for shining a light on evictions, one of the most critical issues facing America. And thank you for providing data that will help inform LSC and others working on evictions, whatever their perspectives might be. I think we would all agree that having data to inform our policy choices is a good thing. And thank you for providing that data.
Thanks, Ron. Appreciate you.
We're now going to turn to a panel of people on the ground. Our programs, LSC funded programs around the country, and to introduce our panel and to moderate the panel, Lynn Jennings, LSC's Vice President for Grants Management.
Thank you, Ron. My name is Lynn Jennings, and I'm Vice President of Grants Management at LSC. Our panel will explore how some of our grantees in various jurisdictions across the country are addressing or planning to address an anticipated eviction tsunami as COVID-19 related eviction moratorium are lifted across the country. Before I introduce the panelists, I want you all to know that in the middle of the panel, I'm going to interrupt our discussion because we're going to be joined by Congressman Tom Emmer of Minnesota. So when that happens, after he's had the opportunity to speak, then we will go back to the rest of the panel. So we're very fortunate to be joined by Judge Sergio De Leon, who was elected as Justice of the Peace of Precinct 5 in Texas in 2012. Before that, he served as a Precinct 5 constable for almost 12 years, and he is responsible for hearing eviction cases in his court, among many other matters. We also have Anna Marie Johnson, who's the Executive Director of Nevada Legal Services, which serves people in poverty throughout the 110,000 square miles of the state, from Las Vegas to remote and rural corners. We also are joined from the other end of the country, Ed Josephson, who is the Director of Limitation and Housing at Legal Services of New York City, where he not only serves low-income citizens in New York City, but operates the largest poverty law training program in the country. And lastly, we have Maria Thomas Jones, who is the Executive Director of Legal Aid of Northwest Texas, which provides civil legal services to low-income individuals and families in 114 counties in North and West Texas. So with that, we're going to get started with Maria. Texas is one of the first states to lift their eviction moratoria. What has Legal Aid of Northwest Texas experienced since the state lifted the moratorium, and what do you anticipate moving forward? Maria, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's good to see everyone and hear everyone. Legal Aid of Northwest Texas, as you said, Lynn, has experienced the moratorium lift as of May. And I have to say, as we look back on our data and that kind of thing, we have seen a spike in our eviction cases. For example, in 2019, the total number of our eviction cases was about 8% from June of 2019. In the first 2 weeks of 2020, even though the moratorium at the state level has just recently been lifted, it has spiked up to 11% of our intakes. And that shows to me it's just the tip of the iceberg, and we're in for a tsunami, as someone said, as the moratorium, weeks of moratorium have ended. And landlords begin to look at proceeding with the evictions that are already in the pipeline. There are lots already in the pipeline, and then there are new ones, evictions that have been filed and the tenants have not been served. And then we have folks that have been served, but then the courts were closed, so courts were not hearing evictions, so those are also in the pipeline. So we have a lot coming our way. What we have done, because we are remote, thanks to LSC's teleworking grant, we were able to move all of our staff to remote work. But the issue becomes, how do you access our services? How do we make sure the clients are aware of what's going on, that we're here and available? How do we get them in the system? And how do we provide them with services? The most important thing, one of the most important things, is to educate our client base, our community partners, and also the judges that are going to be hearing the eviction cases. So we've done a lot in all of those areas, and let me just talk a little bit about that. First of all, again, we were able to do virtual clinics where we utilized bar associations such as the Tarrant County Bar Volunteer Attorney Association and the Dallas Volunteer Attorney Program, where they were able to train, we were able to recruit and train pro bono attorneys to assist in eviction defense matters. In addition, we had remote telephone intake, we had online intake, and we had to move staff from other intake scenarios into those particular ones that were remote in that way. We also provided and canvassed, because we cover so many jurisdictions and venues, we had to basically canvass all of our service area and understand what was going on in the courts, what were the protocols, what were the procedures, were they open, were they doing virtual hearings, were they doing telephone hearings, and make sure that we had trained our staff and our volunteers and could provide good information and advice to applicants and clients that were facing eviction. We also were able to do social media, where we did videos, we used Facebook Live. We, again, as I said, did clinics where we did your Know Your Rights, so that we could address all the things, the issues that were changing, because it kept changing and changing. When the moratorium was first put into place, you know, it ended at a particular time, and then it changed, and then we had CARES. And so being able to give information to those who were facing eviction was critical. And so those were some of the things that we did to make sure that our folks that were facing eviction had the knowledge that they needed. And then we also talk with the courts to make sure that they were aware of the forms that we had prepared, pro se packets, because not everybody's going to have an attorney, unfortunately, but we prepared pro se packets that we could send to the JP courts for those that were unrepresented, flyers that had Know Your Rights, and also educated the JP courts on the CARES Act and the state moratorium and the database that was available for them to check and see if the property was covered by CARES in the meantime. So there was a lot going on, but education and access to an attorney is critical.
Great, thank you so much, and to your hardworking staff, that's incredibly helpful. Let's turn now to Judge De Leon, who is in Tarrant County, Texas, which encompasses Fort Worth. What measures has the court engaged in terms of helping to keep people housed? Explain to us how the court has had to adapt during the COVID crisis. Judge De Leon?
Yes, well, good morning and thank you for having me. This is a fascinating conversation and honored to take part in it. The court has been preparing and essentially coping with this new normal. The Supreme Court of Texas mandated that every court adopt a COVID operating plan. And so what that looks like, the new normal in our court, is all of our staff having to wear a face mask, as well as any litigant that comes to the court having to wear a face mask. It is plexiglass at the judge's bench and in our workspace where people file cases. It is cleaning crews coming in to disinfect after each docket, and staggered dockets as to minimize the number of litigants that are in our court and also in the hallway. All of these naturally very cumbersome, but so necessary to protect the litigants, to protect the court staff, and also the judge, him or herself, because this is a requirement of states, courts across the state of Texas.
So, and obviously, Maria mentioned that they developed a lot of pro se package. You'll be seeing a lot of pro se individuals during this time. So how do you ensure adequate access to the courts for those that are representing themselves pro se? What are you preparing for there?
Well, in that sense, our court has taken a great deal of steps in order to educate the general public about the eviction process. When the national narrative started focusing on eviction courts, I realized that we had to do something out of the ordinary to really reach out to the community. And so we started thinking outside the box, and that's when we partnered with collaborated with Legal Aid of Northwest Texas, where we conducted a Facebook Live conversation on the eviction process, which also included the appeal and applicable appeal information for litigants. So they were getting that piece from an attorney from Legal Aid, which is critically important. As part of that conversation, we talked about writs of re-entry in the event an unscrupulous landlord decided to legally lock someone out, and also writs of restoration in the event utilities were cut off. And that was a very great local conversation that we had. As a result, we had a lot of news media outlets inquire about what we were doing and decided to disseminate a lot of that information. We had an article in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, and also our Spanish language media picked up on that. And so they were able to disseminate the information to Espanol across the Dallas-Fort Worth media market. Additionally, we partnered up with the City of Fort Worth Neighborhood Office and the Tarrant County Neighborhood Office to disseminate information from the CARES Act. We took the liberty of mailing out information to both parties about that, so they could be given some advance notice in order to apply for those funds, for landlords to be made whole and for renters to essentially to stay in their house, because there is some time in applying and qualifying for those funds. So these are some of the steps that we took. And as a matter of fact, today we have, as an added measure, we brought in representatives from those various offices for our eviction docket. We have eviction court going on right now where I have a visiting judge, and we're asking litigants if they want to try to troubleshoot that particular case and try to resolve it before it goes before the judge. So these are all the measures that we've taken. We hope we have some success because while I realize that judges are neutral arbitrators in these eviction cases, nonetheless, I personally feel because of our elective role, we have a duty to serve the constituency.
Mhm. And to your mind, is this the first time that during your tenure that you've been so proactive in reaching out to the community to educate them on such issues?
Absolutely. This is the first time we've engaged in such, a prevention end, if you will. And it's just because of the gravity of the situation. And as Mrs. Thomas Moore points out, or Thomas Jones, it points out that another wave is coming, and we anticipate that taking place about 30 days after the moratorium lifts, because landlords will be required to give a 30-day notice, not a 3-day notice. So you'll see a surge of evictions, at least in Texas and in Tarrant County, sometime around Labor Day.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your efforts. Maria, it's great that you've partnered with the courts here. Who else have you partnered with in your large service area to sort of spread the word about people knowing their rights and reaching out to affected individuals and families?
Yes, it's very important. We can't do it alone. It's going to take all of us to do that, and so it's important that we partner. We've partnered with our community partners, which are domestic violence shelters, homeless coalitions, the court, of course, and others, community groups as well. We have responded. We, along with other legal aids, responded to the Supreme Court's request for input regarding the eviction moratorium itself, any extensions, and then the new pleading requirement requiring a verification that your property is not covered by the CARES Act. So that was very important and was a statewide effort. So I think collaborating with folks is very, very important. We also, as I indicated, collaborated with the judges to make sure that we had protocols. They understood where they could find the database to find out if properties were covered by CARES. We gave forms and making sure that the proceedings were not being in violation of the state law. We canvassed courts regarding the policies and procedures and protocols. We also did internal training as well as external training, because a lot of the courts are moving to virtual Zoom hearings, that kind of thing. So being able to train our advocates, our pro bono folks about how to do Zoom hearings to make sure that they are looking for due process issues. Sometimes our client community does not have internet access, and technology can be a challenge in both rural communities where internet is sparse. They also have other issues such as transportation if they have to go to the court, how to do that effectively and still stay safe. And I give kudos to the judge because that court has given a very thoughtful opinion about what's going to happen if you go to court to keep people safe. So we have partnered with the bar associations as well, as I said, with the Dallas Volunteer Attorney Program and the Tarrant County Volunteer Attorneys Program, such as that, because we can't do it alone. We need pro bono help, and there are people out there that want to help us. We also have used social media, Twitter, videos, and we share that with communities and partners, and we continue to update those videos so that we can make sure that the community has the information and can go equipped with an attorney, either to the Zoom hearing, or if they are not able, that they have the information they need to effectively represent themselves before the court.
Great, thank you so much. Now I'm going to turn it over to Abby Kuzma, who is an LSC board member, to introduce Congressman Emmer.
Hello, my name's Abby Kuzma, and I serve on the Legal Services Corporation Board of Directors. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Congressman Tom Emmer. Congressman Emmer was sworn in for his first term in the U.S. House of Representatives on January 6, 2015. He's currently serving his third term. His district includes most of the northern suburbs of the Twin Cities, as well as St. Cloud, Minnesota. He was recently elected by his colleagues to join the House GOP leadership team as chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee for the 116th Congress. Currently, he sits on the House Financial Services Committee. He's also a member of the Republican Deputy Whip Team and the House Republican Steering Committee. Prior to his election to Congress, he was in private practice for 2 decades, eventually opening his own law firm in 2005. He served in the Minnesota House of Representatives from 2004 to 2008. Before that, he served on city councils in Independence and Delano. Please join me now in welcoming Congressman Emmer.
Thank you for the detailed background. I appreciate it. And I hope everyone on this call has been healthy and you're all safe. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. I want to offer a special thanks, obviously, to President Flagg, as well as to the Vice President for Grants Management, Lynn Jennings, for moderating the panel this morning, and for Matthew Desmond's fantastic work to shine a light on housing insecurity across our country. For those of you that don't know, I mean, you now know, I am Tom Emmer, and I have the privilege of representing Minnesota's 6th congressional district. As some of you might know, and you just heard, prior to public service, I was an attorney. Actually, I take that back. Like my Marine would tell me, once a Marine, always a Marine. Once an attorney, always an attorney. I just do it differently today than I did for 20 plus years. Since coming to Congress, some of you may have seen me at other Legal Services Corporation events. I believe I've done at least 3, and I guess today would be 4. So hopefully we'll see each other in person at some point. I much prefer in-person events that we were able to do previously, but I'm still honored to be able to join you in this way today. In fact, based on my history as a lawyer and my belief that lawyers are incredibly important, in fact, critical, essential to protection of freedom, I believe those of us that have been in the profession have an obligation to stand up and speak up for the profession while we're in Congress. And we need to advocate for the noble and selfless work that you people do each and every day to serve those people in need. A good lawyer in my life is a selfless advocate for their client. We're also supposed to be a very self-deprecating bunch. And I've heard my fair share of lawyer jokes, as you probably have, but believe me, I refuse to tell them. In this position that I have, I'm not going to do anything to suggest that our profession is not anything but necessary and vital to all the public. To give you just a little bit more background on who I am, I attended William Mitchell College of Law at night and went on to open my own law firm. As you heard, I practiced law for over 20 years, although emphasizing over 2 decades. I mean, I get up every day and still think my hair is dark, but that's a different issue. Those are my challenges. At different times during my practice, I was licensed in Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota. I was also admitted to practice in federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court. And if you take anything away from the small segment that I'm going to present to you here today, I hope it's the sincere thank you for all the work that you people do, especially during these challenging times that we're in right now, because I do know how important your work is. And I've been proud to join the annual letter supporting LSC funding for several years now. The fight to lead this letter on our side of the aisle is fierce, believe it or not. So this year, I decided to relent and let my colleagues, Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania, Susan Brooks from Indiana, and Fred Upton from Michigan take most of the credit. Our gathering, obviously, today looks a little different, and so does our world. Over the past few months, members of our community have faced financial and legal hurdles like never before. This COVID-19 crisis has caused families to lose the income they depend on and that they have depended on. And households across our country have gone from financially stable to insecure seemingly overnight. Americans are in desperate need of advocates, lawyers like you, who fight every day to keep these families from being uprooted and displaced. As you know, and as I heard you talking about when I was getting on this call, the CARES Act prohibits, it does many different things when it comes to housing. One of the things it does is it prohibits evictions of those with a federal mortgage until July 24th, with a protection on vacating these families for at least another month. Some renters will recertify their income at any time to adjust their federally assisted rent payment. These and the additional protections, they can. I think I said they will, but they can recertify to protect themselves. And these additional protections provided by the CARES Act are really only enforced and protected by people like you. It's the lawyers and legal services that we offer that make sure people know and use their rights. You also know firsthand how housing can intersect with every other measure when it comes to our quality of life, from healthcare, including mental health, to employment, education, and crime. Having stable housing can do wonders to improve all of the outcomes in these areas. Just prior to this outbreak, I was able to tour some of the more recent multifamily housing developments in the 6th District of Minnesota, as well as announce my co-sponsorship of the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. This bill would expand, and I'm going to say will expand, the low-income housing tax credit, and it's projected to increase the supply of affordable rental housing by over 550,000 units. To those who would say not in my backyard, I say yes, right here in our Minnesota communities. In addition, the intersection of housing and mental health touches upon several of the initiatives I've been working on since I got in Congress to support and demystify the relationship and the need for mental health improvements. In the work that I've done on the Financial Services Committee, which has jurisdiction over several housing agencies, has been crucial as well. During this crisis, I led a letter with 30 of my colleagues to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, asking that they continue some of the telemental health services they've instituted during the COVID crisis in order to study and propose that these services continue far beyond this time. In my view, we're not going backward. We need to go forward. We made some serious advances despite the crisis that we were faced with. And it's not time to go back to where we were before the crisis. In fact, it's time to use the advances that we've made and expand on them. Especially in sprawling states like Minnesota, technology can break down the physical barriers of distance and ensure everyone receives the proper care they need. It can also break down the stigmatism that everyone doesn't need mental health care. This is a challenge that no matter how hard we work, it seems to constantly be an obstacle. I'm, as you probably can tell, deeply proud to be a lawyer, and I'm proud of what all you do to ensure that Americans are treated fairly and equally. I'm also proud to work hard to make sure you have the resources to protect and reinforce those freedoms. Without you, we wouldn't have the means to ensure that our justice system improves, especially now. Your legal assistance to those in need is an example to everyone who care deeply about the access and quality of legal services that our justice system provides. Thank you again for the work that each and every one of you do every day to advocate for those most in need. And again, I really appreciate the invitation to join you briefly. Thanks for everything you do. And if there's anything we can ever do to help you, please let me know. Thanks.
Congressman Emmer, thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you for your leadership on all these issues.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Thank you. Stay healthy.
Thank you. All right. So again, I too would like to add my thanks to Representative Emmer and his leadership on this issue and his continued advocacy for LFC and all that you do. Now we're going to turn our attention away from Texas and move to the state of Nevada and look to see what was going on there. Anna Maria, what measures did the state of Nevada and localities put in place to keep people housed during the crisis?
Well, when the governor first issued his emergency directive on March 16th that basically closed the state down, the casinos closed, most businesses closed. The courts also closed at that time. They weren't letting anybody in. All types of hearings and trials were suspended at that time. But they said nothing about eviction hearings. And local courts at that time were left on their own. Do we have them? Do we not? People still continued to file evictions. And some courts on their own decided we're going to stay these evictions and not hear them during the emergency directive. Other courts said, no, we're going to continue to hear the evictions and go forward with them. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that Directive 8 was issued by Governor Sisolak, and that put a moratorium on all evictions, starting with the issuance of that directive. And it also stayed all evictions that were in the pipeline, whether they'd been filed or whether the order had been signed but was yet to go to the constable or sheriff's office for service of the writ. Right now, the state is reopening. We have businesses opening up again. The courts are also opening up again and rescheduling hearings that have been stayed before. We're not sure yet when the eviction moratorium is going to be lifted. We had expected to hear something last Friday, but that press conference was postponed. Some people believe that the moratorium will end as of June 30th. Our reading of the directive says no, it shouldn't lift until the actual emergency directive itself, the original one, is lifted. But we're not sure what's going to happen come June 30th. At a meeting that the Access to Justice Commission had last Friday afternoon, the judges were talking about the evictions that were in the pipeline at the time. And the city of Las Vegas alone has 100,000 evictions that were stayed and are waiting to be heard. That doesn't include any filings for any late rent that could have happened during the time period of the moratorium. So the backlog is going to be humongous once the moratorium is lifted. The moratorium itself did not stop our housing work. It was unfortunate, but we have had a number of landlords that decided to use self-help methods and were illegally trying to evict people. So our casework during the moratorium continued and actually increased over the last 3 months or so.
Could you go into a little more detail about the self-help evictions and what your business has been doing and some of the stories that you have from that? It's quite startling.
Sure. Well, illegal lockouts in Nevada have always been illegal. Landlords are supposed to use the court process. And for the most part, they do. The number of illegal lockout cases that we've had over the years are just a handful. And in preparing for the meeting today, I looked up our statistics, and in 2019, we had a total of just 12 illegal lockout cases. And that has ballooned during the moratorium. Just in the last 3 months, we've had over 800 illegal lockout cases. And there were 2 corporate landlords in the Las Vegas or Southern Nevada area that were the worst offenders, and they were very aggressive in trying to get their tenants out of their apartments. These 2 corporate landlords hire their own security force. They call them a police force, and the security men are armed with guns. They have tasers, they have handcuffs, they look just like a police force. And during this time period, they have done things like knock down the door to the apartment, tased the tenant, dragged them out of the apartment, handcuffed them, and then took all of their belongings and threw them out into the parking lot. In one particular case, they took the tenant out, handcuffed him, threw all of his belongings out into the street. And because this was an apartment that came with all of the furniture, they took out the bed, they took out the stove, they took out the refrigerator, they took out the sink, they took out the toilet, everything that they could remove to make that apartment uninhabitable for the person to move back in. They have done things like just simply remove the door so that anybody could come in and out. They put boots on the locks so that they're either locking the person into the apartment and won't let them out, or not let them in. We've had landlords that are turning off the utilities. They're turning off air conditioning when in Southern Nevada it's already been 110 degrees. We had one landlord who was using sexual harassment, demanding that the young single mothers or young single tenants, female tenants, have sex with him or he would do an illegal lockout. The cases have just been horrendous. And we've been taking all of these cases to court, and we are winning. Under Nevada law, you can get damages for illegally locking out your tenant. And in one case, the actions by the landlord were so egregious that our tenant was awarded over $6,000 in damages.
Wow. So, and this, it's my understanding from our planning call that this, you continue to have to show up in person at the courthouse for these actions. Is that not right?
Yes. This is, the illegal lockout hearings were the only types of cases that the courts insisted that both parties appear at the courthouse in order to hear the case. In all other cases that continued during this moratorium, you were given the option of appearing either in person or by other alternative means. But the illegal lockout cases required the parties to appear in person. And that became a hardship for many of our clients, particularly during the time period when there was no public transportation. So getting from wherever the tenant was downtown to central downtown Las Vegas or central downtown Reno or anywhere else where the hearings were being held when there was no public transportation was very difficult. And in some of these instances with the landlords that were doing illegal lockouts, they watched and waited for a tenant to leave. So our client could be going down to the courthouse to have their illegal lockout hearing held. And while they were down at the courthouse, the landlord has now just locked the door, preventing them from getting back in. So they win and they come home to find out that they can't get in their door. And we've got more work that we have to do in order to get the tenant back into their housing.
Mm-hmm. So you've already seen a tremendous uptick in cases as it relates to illegal lockouts. So when the lifting of the moratorium and 100,000 case backlog, how is Legal Aid of Nevada preparing itself to handle all of this?
We have staffed up, thanks to the funding that was available through the CARES Act. We've been able to hire additional staff to help us with the surge that we know is coming, and for handling the increase in illegal lockout cases that we've had. We are preparing what we're calling rapid response teams. That's a combination of our staff plus our volunteer attorney, volunteer attorneys from our pro bono program. The rapid response teams are going to be in the courthouse. We hope in the courthouse that they'll let us have a table there, seeing everybody who is there for their evictions. If they're not going to let us in the courthouse, we'll set up our tables out on the sidewalk in front of the courthouse. But we are preparing as much as we can right now, getting self-help packets ready to go to hand out to all those that we may not be able to assist personally. We have our classes on how to represent yourself in eviction cases that are live on YouTube Live, and they're also have been recorded and are on our website. And we're doing as much as we can to prepare.
Great. Well, thank you for all your efforts. Now, lastly, I'm going to turn to Ed Josephson from Legal Aid of New York City. As we all know, the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic was the state of New York and New York City. The state's moratorium on evictions will end on June 20th. Now, New York City is one of the few jurisdictions in the country that dedicate significant resources for low-income clients to have representation during evictions proceedings. As you look to this being lifted, Ed, what are your concerns as the moratorium expires?
Well, we have a paradox in New York City because we have the strongest tenant protections in the country, and we have the highest rate of tenant representation probably in the country, and we're facing probably the biggest catastrophe in the country. And I was able to find some statistics from.
Ed has frozen. Ed, can you
no.
try? Can we try to get you back?
Yes. Oh, God.
There we go.
I'm back.
All right.
Sorry. I was able to find some statistics from New York University's Furman Center, which is pretty much the gold standard for this kind of thing, about what kind of a tsunami we're looking at. And what we find is, as a baseline, there are 100,000 eviction cases in a so-called good year in New York City. What the Furman Center says is, if you look at the 1.2 million people who lost their jobs since March in New York City, and you winnow that down to people under 80% of AMI who right now do not have pandemic unemployment or regular unemployment, you're looking at 100,000 families right now who can't pay their rent, right now. So that means we're doubling the number of evictions from 100,000 to 200,000. But what's worse is when pandemic unemployment runs out at the end of July, then according to this same study, we would be looking at another 300,000 people who can't pay their rent. So that means instead of the 100,000 from last year, we're looking at 500,000 eviction cases, 500%. In money terms, they did an analysis, and they said right now, to make up the shortfall in rent, we need $65 million a month in rental subsidies. And come August, when the CARES Act money runs out, we're looking at $352 million a month in New York City to stop a wave of evictions. And so, the takeaway from this is that even though we have a lot of lawyers, all the lawyers in the world are not going to make a dent in this problem unless there's the financial support. And so as Professor Desmond suggested at the end of his talk, what is really needed by our clients here is some kind of Section 8 for all. You know, it's something that has to rise to the level of this crisis and try to meet this need.
They were talking, Anna Marie was talking about the backlog. Is there a huge, because as soon as that moratorium is lifted, you probably have a huge backlog. And how has Legal Services of New York City been preparing for this? As you said, you know, it is just one of the efforts because of this incredibly huge problem that is being generated based on the unemployment rate and everything else that's going on related to COVID-19. But then how are you going to deal with sort of the day-to-day crisis that comes about?
Well, last year, Legal Services, combined with all of our not-for-profit partners in the city, of which there are many, we handled 30% of the 100,000 eviction cases, which was amazing because 5 years ago we were at 1%, now we're at 30%. But that won't look so good if suddenly we have 200% or 300% of the eviction cases. So we have 200 advocates in New York City in legal services, and we're gearing up to try to represent as many people as possible. But the other thing that we're doing is we're trying to work with the courts and frankly put pressure on the court system together with, you know, organizers and our other partners to slow down the opening of the courts as much as possible, both because no one will be able to handle this flood of evictions, but also to the extent that they're talking about handling cases virtually, pro se tenants can't handle virtual appearances. So what really has to happen is that the only cases that should be allowed to proceed are the 2 attorney cases for the foreseeable future. And hopefully that may slow things down enough so that the federal or state financial assistance has time to come through, and then we can really get a handle on this crisis.
Okay. And then when you mentioned you have 200 attorneys, is that 200 alone just handling housing cases?
Well, it's 200 attorneys and non-attorney advocates, you know, paralegals and so on. But those are, yes, just devoted to housing eviction prevention. Wow. And also anti-harassment work.
Well, I noticed that we're at time, and there's the problems created by COVID-19 are too large to be handled in just a 90-minute talk, and we understand that, and we just wanted to highlight some of the issues and some of the incredible work that is being done by LSC grantees. Of course, we know that you all are doing incredible work and making great sacrifices, but I want to thank our panelists for being here today and all of the work that they're doing. And as we wrap up, I'm going to send it over to Father Pius Petrick, who is the Vice Chair of LSC's board. But thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your incredible dedication and work.
Lynn, thank you very much. And like you, I just want to send a note of thanks to all those who were able to participate in our briefing today. As a lot of people know, for the last 40 years, Legal Services Corporation has been really proclaiming the problem of the gap, the real crisis in legal services that has been occurring in our country. And that's really been much worse today. And there is perhaps no sector in which that is clearer, the lack and the gap of legal services, than in the housing issue. Housing is, amongst all our grantees, usually either the number 2 or sometimes even the number 1 set of issues that our grantees have to deal with. And on top of that, as we've heard from a number of our guests today, the problem that COVID-19 is going to add to that. Because of the number of people who are now unemployed, the lack of income, there's going to be an even greater pressure on individuals with regards to the possibility of eviction. And yet, despite all our experience with housing, despite all our experience with eviction, we've had so little data on which to base policy and even which to base legal norms and rules. And so we are immensely grateful to Matthew Desmond, not just for his book, but for the ongoing work of the Eviction Lab, which has gathered the information about the reality of eviction. You know, I was struck in listening to Matt's talk about one particular statistic, and that is that the number one determinant in deciding whether evictions are going to occur is the presence of children. And that presence of children does not make the chance of eviction less, but it makes it more, much more, 3 times as often. This is an incredible statistic to me, and shows us that there are some real problems, I think, that we have to address with our eviction and our eviction courts. And that ongoing gathering of data, which LSC is committed to doing thanks to a special funding from Congress, will continue our knowledge of the reality of eviction and eviction courts. And I want to thank especially the panels. We hear things like data and the collection of data from Mr. Desmond. And he reminds us, as do the panelists, that behind every statistic, behind every figure is a face, a family, a person who has faced eviction. And eviction, as we know, is more than just about losing one's residence, about the tearing up of a lease. It's about losing one's home. And in one's home is often the very center of one's life. It determines one's community. It protects one's things. It's the place of the home where the family gathers together. So the loss of a home isn't just one more court case. It's really the loss of a whole lifestyle that can have a cascading effect on the quality of a life of an individual, a family, and even a community. And on top of all of the difficulty that we see in the housing courts in the cases of eviction, the issue of COVID-19 and the damage that it has wrought throughout our country has made that and continues to make that even worse. We know that there's been a great difficulty in evictions in the United States, even before 2020. And we now hear from the people who do this on the ground, from folks from as far away from each other as Nevada and New York, that these cases are going to explode in the next few months as the moratoria on eviction cases are removed. Thankfully, there are people who are turning to these issues, not just our own grantees, but even members of Congress. Tom Emmer, who has been a wonderful friend to Legal Services Corporation. Whenever we ask Congressman Emmer to speak, he always says to us, well, just tell me where and when. And we're grateful for Mr. Emmer and his colleagues in Congress for bringing these issues more to the forefront and helping us to work on them. And so just as a final note, I want to thank, as I often try to do every time, those of our grantees, those lawyers in the field who work with those men, women, families who are facing eviction, facing the loss of their lifestyle and their family, and helping them to find another way rather than just life on the street. This is the important work of caring for the poor, of the people who have no other option and nowhere else to turn. We at LSC continue to do the work of caring for America's poor in the face of the loss of civil justice. And we are grateful for all of you who have been here, who've listened to these presentations, and who will remain committed to continuing this work. Thank you very much. Stay healthy. God bless.